In our daily reading today, we are going to, in this video, just look at Nehemiah chapter 13 because there's so much there. I just want to focus on it. It's the last chapter of the book of Nehemiah, and there's just a lot going on that, to close out this book. And essentially, to give you an overview of what's going on is Nehemiah goes and presents himself to Artaxerxes the king, and he's gone for a time, and while he's gone, it all falls apart. Now, prior to this, they were dedicating themselves, they were giving thanks unto God, and then, Nehemiah leaves, and then we see sin creeping in. Eliashib, the priest, he has made league with Tobiah. Now, if you remember, Tobiah is mentioned earlier on, I think in Nehemiah chapter 2, but he's one of the main heathen that were fighting against the work of God. Sanballat and Tobiah were the two main, people that were fighting against the work. And so what Eliashib the priest does is he takes this part of the temple, the house of God, that housed all the victuals and all of the offerings that was to care for the Levites, those that were doing the work of God. It was to house that. Well, he cleaned all of that out, and he allowed this heathen to come in and set up shop in the house of God and gave him a portion of it. And so Nehemiah comes back to find that the Levites are not doing the work. They've been scattered. Eliashib the priest has got this heathen there that has set up a shop in the house of God. Well, Nehemiah, of course, he throws him out, but that's not all. Then he finds that there was a bunch of work being done on the Sabbath, so they were profaning the Sabbath, in which they were not supposed to do. He finds that going on, so essentially he locks people out. And I love what he says there in verse number 21. He says, "And I testified against them and said unto them, Why lodge ye about the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands on you." Nehemiah, he was something else. But there's some, and then it closes out, and then there's some marriages that are dissolved when they were unequally yoked. And that's kind of a big part of this chapter is the concept of being unequally yoked. Now, for some takeaways on this, I want to give you this, and that is, number one, being unequally yoked will cause the work of God to suffer. Eliashib the priest was yoked up to a heathen in Tobiah, someone who was anti-Christ, okay? He was against the work of God, yet Eliashib the priest, he was one of God's people. He was supposed to be a man of God, the high priest, but yet he was yoked up with heathen, and because of that, the work of God suffered. So we need to make sure that we stay equally yoked in our relationships. And another takeaway was found in verse number 13. When Nehemiah, he set treasures over, so that wouldn't happen again. He set men over the things that were to come into the treasury to make sure that the work of God was sustained. We see their names in verse number 13, and it says this, "For they were counted faithful." Listen, faithfulness is important. It's absolutely important. When you are faithful, then you will be entrusted with duties, just as we see right here. And the greater the work that needs to be done, the greater a faithfulness that is required. So that's one of the takeaways as well. And sometimes you just got to fight for what's right. We see Nehemiah in verse number 11. "Then I contended with the rulers." Verse number 17. "Then I contended with the nobles." Verse number 25. "And I contended with them." And where he talked about 21, where he told them he was going to lay hands on them. Sometimes there are some things worth fighting for. And the things of God certainly are at the top of that list. And so we see there's some things worth fighting for. And then lastly here, we see Nehemiah as a man of constant prayer. We see it in verse number 14. He says, "Remember me, O God." Verse number 22, "Remember me, O God." Verse number 29, "Remember them, O God," talking about the ones that were acting ungodly. "Remember them, O God, because they have defiled the priesthood." And in verse number 31, "Remember me, O God, for good." And so there's just a lot of good stuff here in Nehemiah chapter 11. We'll deal with Nehemiah chapter 13. We'll deal with Proverbs chapter 13 in a separate video. But just a lot of great stuff to close out this book, and I hope it's been a blessing to you. God bless.